All right, we ready to go? All right, so good evening, President Wiley, Dr. Kuhn, members of the board. Thank you for the opportunity to present tonight. I have been looking forward to this. I'm really excited to share. So kind of same philosophy as always. If you have a question, just stop me and we'll talk about it right then. We have a lot of ground to cover tonight, so I'm going to do my best to articulate slow and well, but also efficiently. So, School Finance 101. I thought of a title for this other than School Finance 101, but I think this probably gets it the best because it is pretty, we're going to get in the weeds a little bit, but not tremendously. And I've got some pretty clear objectives tonight. So, number one, to gain a better understanding about school finance and how it works in Texas. I want you to be able to explain just the basic concepts to your friends, neighbors. It's really important to have that just general understanding. And then also understand the correlation between property tax and district revenue. A lot of people think as property values go up, so does the revenue for a school district, and we're going to find out if that's true or not tonight. So let's start at the beginning. Funding elements for Texas. So you've probably seen some of these, some of them maybe not, but first and foremost is the basic allotment. So this amount currently is $6,160. It was set in 2019 and has not been adjusted since. So no adjustment for inflationary factors, anything like that. We know costs have increased, but our basic allotment has stayed the same. This is essentially what the state says we should get per student in revenue. So right now we know there's a legislative session going on and there's a committee substitute for House Bill 2 that is proposing an increase in that basic allotment to $6,555. It's not set in stone yet, so we hope it comes. But for the sake of this presentation, we're just going to talk on current law. Right now we're building our budget on current law. Current law is $6,160 a student. So let's go over to entitlement. The word entitlement. So what does that mean for us? So entitlement is our tier 1 revenue, our tier 1 allotment that is funded through both local and state. We're gonna talk through that, but you'll hear the word entitlement several times tonight. Our local share. So what is the local share? The local share is what the state says based on our property values and our tax rate, how much of our entitlement we should be able to fund locally. So that's local share. Then you go to state share. It's essentially the difference between our entitlement less what we're supposed to pay locally. You know, we're supposed to pay locally. Here's what the state share is. And then guaranteed yield. Guaranteed yield comes into play at tier 2 revenue. So you're going to hear this term later on in the presentation, but just keep in mind, guaranteed yield is tier 2. So we're going to talk about the different tiers and what they mean. So acronyms. If you've been around school business or schools in general, you know everyone loves a good acronym. School finance is no different. So here's a few, there's many, but here's the main ones that we're going to talk about tonight. So average daily attendance, or ADA. So at schools, we're funded on ADA, average daily attendance. We're not funded on enrollment. So average daily attendance is how many students are enrolled, what's their attendance rate, and you get a percentage. Then you add in a W and you get WADA. So it's weighted average daily attendance. This comes in to play for tier 2. And this is different weights. So students, we'll talk about the weights here in a little bit, but WADA is weighted average daily attendance. Then we have ASF, that's Available School Fund. It's a per capita payment. Every school in the state gets this. It's a little over $400 a student, and it's paid on your prior year ADA. So has nothing to do with your current year. It's paid on prior year number. Every school gets it. It's just kind of a, you'll see here in a little bit, it's not a huge amount, but it is some. Then we have MCR. You may recognize that one. That's the maximum compressed rate. It has huge implications for us and our revenue. And it's driven by property value growth. The rate, we'll get into this also a little bit more, but the rate is really set and certified by the state. And then LFA, so the local fund assignment. So this is essentially what the state says we should be able to afford or pay of our Tier 1 entitlement. So I want just to point out the 2 footnotes, okay? So the 2 in red, average daily attendance and weighted average daily attendance. These data elements are not known until when the year is over. So we go through an entire year really on best estimates, okay? So this is how not only we build our budget, but we're really working throughout the year, constantly checking these numbers, running templates, looking at our enrollment trends and our attendance percentage, because how we're initially funded and how it settles doesn't happen until the school year's over. And then the local fund assignment, the current year state value, that is also estimated a year in advance. So I hope out of this, what you see is there's a lot of things, a lot of elements that drive how we're funded that are really estimates, best estimates for things happening at least a year in advance. So a lot of process goes through, a lot of thought and process goes through really nailing down accurate ways to estimate these things, because it is difficult. It's not a given number that we get to predict our revenue. Okay, so public school revenue sources. There's 3 main sources, and tonight we're just going to talk general fund. So when we're talking about these revenue sources, this is general fund revenue. We've got local, state, and federal. And this federal is not talking federal grants. So we're going to go into detail about what these federal revenues are, but think federal revenue in the general fund, not Title I, not ESSER, anything like that. This is general fund only. So first is local revenue. So for Abilene ISD, our local revenue is about 31% of our total general fund revenue. And in that 31%, here's really what makes up the local share. Property tax collections is the majority, 94%. Then interest income on investments. We have, quite a bit of money that we invest, and right now rates are a little volatile, but that is also a source of local revenue. And then these 2 are very small. So miscellaneous revenues, think like when we rent a building and someone pays us to lease our facility. That's just kind of miscellaneous general revenue that really doesn't fit anywhere else. And then ticket sales for things like athletics, fine art events, that lives in local. Then we have the state. So for Abilene ISD, so about 67% of our general fund revenue is state, so we rely heavily on state revenue. The majority of that is the available school fund and foundation programs, 92%. This TRS on behalf comes in at 8%. This is, TRS on behalf is not really a revenue source for us. So as an employee of the school district, we do not pay into Social Security, we pay into TRS. The state matches that, and we have to account for it. So really this is revenue coming in from the state that we account for, and it goes right back out to TRS as a match of what we pay in for our employees. So it's an in and out, it's a complete wash, but it is accounted for in state revenue sources. And then federal revenue. So again, not grants. Grants are on special revenue, so just federal living in the general fund. The majority is SHARS, so school health and related services. So this is Medicaid billable services that are provided to our students that we can file and get reimbursement for. It is not equal reimbursement for our cost. And you may remember in the last budget, then going into this year, I've alluded to it once. There's been major changes at the federal level, and so SHARS revenue and SHARS reimbursement, what used to reimburse a lot of our cost reimburses less now. We just it's not something that's growing for us, it's declining. Indirect cost on federal grants. So we're allowed to essentially charge an indirect cost rate on federal grants that live in special revenue funds for the administration of those grants. And that money comes to the general fund. It's not a huge amount, but it is some. Then QSCB, so Qualified School Construction Bonds, that program is an old program. It's no longer something that's around, but we do have one bond that is a QSCB. And essentially, the federal government will send you a subsidy, and it helps offset interest cost. So we do get some money for that, but it's to offset the interest cost on the bond payment. And then impact aid. So it's not a huge amount either, but it is some. Impact aid is essentially another government program for to help in property tax loss, like if you have a military base in your town, or like a federal piece of land that is not taxable. Impact aid offsets the loss in property tax revenue. Any questions on any of that before I move on? Okay, so just taking a look at our revenue sources, when you combine the local, state, and federal, this is kind of how our picture looks. So we've got a very small amount in federal revenue for the general fund. About 31% is local and the rest is state. So huge portion of state revenue coming in. And we'll talk here in a second, and we'll find out as our values grow in property tax, what does it do to this share? All right, property tax. So our property tax rate is two components. So when you get your tax bill, you have one rate, but for us it's two separate buckets: M&O, so maintenance and operation, and interest and sinking. Maintenance and operation funds day-to-day operations, so salaries, supplies, the electric bill, anything like that, programs for our students. This rate is also broken into two segments. We'll get into that in just a second. And then the interest and sinking rate only can be used to pay debt payments, bond debt payments. So essentially you figure your INS rate on what you need to make your debt payment, and that's kind of how your rate is set. It's pretty simple. The M&O is where it gets a little tricky, and we'll get into that in a second. But INS only bond debt payments, M&O operations. So here's just another way to look at it, two buckets. So when we get a payment from the appraisal district in our office of tax collections, it just comes in as a lump sum payment. And in accounting, we do a tax worksheet that essentially goes through all the years and how much money in that payment was collected. We have this whole report of what years it was collected on and what the M&O rate was for that year and the INS rate for that year. And we calculate how much of that payment is maintenance and operation and how much is interest and sinking. And then we just get one payment, and in our office, we manage which bucket it goes to. So again, M&O's paying salaries, classroom supplies, transportation, things of that nature. And then debt service cannot be used for operational cost, only for bonded debt. And it's only voter-approved bonds. Okay, so tax rate components. Here's where we start getting into some detail. So I mentioned just a second ago that M&O is really into two separate tiers or separate allocations. Tier 1 is made up of our compressed tax rate, so our MCR. You might have heard that earlier. It was on our acronym list. And then Tier 2 is our golden and copper pennies. And then also we have our INS rate. So 3 different tiers make up our entire tax rate. So this is just a preview. We're going to walk through each tier right now. So just a little about the max compressed rate. So compression, as our value grows, if our value grows more than 2.5%, our tax rate is compressed. So think of this stack being our maximum compressed rate. So the more our value grows, the more this is compressed. So pennies start moving away. And this is a calculation we'll walk through in just a second that we don't really have control over. And it's all driven by how much our property values grow. So there's a few other rules. No district may have an MCR less than 90% of any other district. That's a fancy way of saying there's a floor. Okay, so in the MCR and the tax rate calculation, the state sets a floor, so there's a minimum. This is the lowest a district can charge. So what if a district had a lot of property value and they were really property wealthy and they wanted to essentially cut their community a break and lower below that floor? What would happen? Well, is that something they could do? The answer is no. We would be penalized. So that floor that's set is really important. If a district was to ever try to tax below the floor, they would adjust our basic allotment. So that $6,160 would go down. So this whole calculation is really pretty clearly defined lanes of things we have to live in that are out of our control.
So as a board, we basically have no choice in ever giving a tax break.
That's right.
The city council, county commissioners can cut their property tax values and it doesn't affect other state aid like ours does.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. We really have some pretty clear defined lanes that our hands, I don't want to say our hands are tied, but there's not a lot of wiggle room in things we can do as far as what our tax rate is. So first tier 1, maximum compressed rate. So I'm going to set this up. This is this stack right here. So imagine if we had, for this year, we're going to talk 24-25, so the year we're in, our maximum compressed rate was 63.9 pennies. So that does not include any kind of anything else. This is based on our property value and the calculation for tax rate. We're at 63.9. The floor, so the very least you could charge was 61.69. So see, we are very close to the floor. Okay, we're only right at 2 pennies above. So think, as our property values, we all know things are happening with the projects coming online. Our rates are growing. It's really important to keep in mind what it will do to those pennies. So Tier 1 MCR, this is set by the state, again, so it's not really something we can control. This funds our entitlement that we'll talk about in a second. So this is calculated on average daily attendance and a few other things like student demographic, district demographics. That has to do with the weights and the allotments. We'll talk about those a little later. So also, rising property values compress this rate. So you can see in 2019, when this law went into effect and the tax rate started being compressed, how much it's changed for Abilene ISD. 2019, it was 96.42 to now, we're at 63.90. So I hope this tells you that as property values grow, does a district get more revenue? The answer is no, it doesn't. Our tax rate is further compressed. So while our rate's growing, we can't tax. So it's not really a huge benefit to us. The basic allotment per student in ADA, which is set in the General Appropriations Act, again, is that 6160 right now in current law. So that has, all of this is kind of making up our Tier 1. Any questions on that?
So are we affected the same way as property, even property-rich districts? Is the same thing happening to them?
Yes.
Are there?
It is. And actually, so it is. And I can tell you something, I won't get into the real weeds of it, but for a district that is very property wealthy is likely at the floor in their MCR. So they're at the 61.69 instead of where we are. And they're probably generating so much property in their local fund assignment property tax off their value, that it's likely they're having to pay back to the state from their property tax in recapture. That is not a problem we have, but districts that are very property wealthy, that's kind of their reality. Does that answer your question?
And you might know, veterans, you might know that school districts used to set their tax rate at like $1.04 and call it a day. And then what Jen just talked about was part of the calculation. Now literally what she's saying is, it's just math. There's this formula, Gary Ernest, our chief appraiser, he approves it, and he reviews it and approves it, and then it gets entered into the state to be approved. So when we consider whether or not there is any wiggle room in the M&O tax rate, the answer is really no. It is exactly what it's calculated.
That's right.
Well, how come some districts have more money than other districts?
So we're going to talk about that in just a second.
That's a good question.
That is a very good question. So,
If you're in a property
Yeah,
rich
tell them.
district, and that district has to give money back to the state, the property owners in that district then are paying for other districts that are not property rich.
that's right. It goes back to the state in recapture, and then the state uses that money to help fund other districts that aren't property wealthy.
It actually goes in the general revenue of the
Yes,
state.
it
It
does.
doesn't go back to school districts directly.
Right.
It's one of the things
It's-
we argue about all the time.
Yeah,
It's just general revenue.
but they're free to use for whatever.
So we don't actually know how they're using that money.
Correct.
I think that's it.
Yep. All right, so tier 1, now let's talk about tier 2. So we've talked about golden and copper pennies. So this is in the enrichment, okay? So tier 1 is really what we are entitled to. Tier 2 is the only way we have as a school district to enrich what we can tax on, okay? So that's these two. So I'm gonna set these up. So the most valuable is the golden. Oh, well, I'm afraid it'll, yeah. So tier 2 is the golden penny. So these are paid out per WADA. So it's right now, so these weights can change. Right now, a golden penny is worth $129.52 per WADA. So that's where those weighted average daily attendance come into play. Also in tier 2 is the copper. So copper is not worth as much. The guaranteed yield on a copper penny is $49.28. Let's see if I can slide these around.
Does that change?
They do. They do change. And actually, in the new House Bill 2, where it's the proposed basic allotment increase, there's also some changes proposed to the guarantee yields of what these are worth. So generally, yes, they change during the legislative session. So golden pennies,
Are the changes an increase or decrease?
they're a slight increase at first, how it's written right now, but then the last I read, the guaranteed yield was dependent also upon any changes that may come in the future with the basic allotment. So if the basic allotment was to increase, the value of these would start decreasing.
Is there a base?
There is not.
So when you said it's $49.28,
Per WADA. So so that's weighted average daily attendance. And we'll talk about that number.
does that decimal go backwards like it did?
It doesn't. So we're talking pennies here.
Oh,
These are dollar amounts. It's a little confusing, especially because these are called pennies. But these amounts are actual penny amounts. So 63 cents, 63.9 cents, based against the property value. These tiers are a dollar amount based on the weighted average daily attendance. Okay?
What's the difference in the water and the ADA?
So the average daily attendance is essentially our enrollment times our just percentage rate, and you get a number. The WADA is weighted, so if you have students that are in bilingual or CTE, those carry a higher weight than just an average, just gen ed student. So the WADA is usually a bigger number than ADA. So they pay these enrichment pennies on WADA, on the weighted.
Currently, we built our budget, the budget is on 80, you might have heard Jen say 12,688. Our WADA is about 6,000 above that. It really depends how the year goes, because it's just an estimate. But because of the weights, it goes up.
Yeah, we built our budget estimate for 24-25 on an ADA of 12,006. Our WADA is around the 18,000, 19,000 neighborhood, to give you an idea.
And the weighting is because certain kids are more expensive to educate.
Correct, that's correct.
Do they get to get counted twice?
No, not, it's really a whole plus, there's different weights for different programs, and it's just whatever the weight is of that program that they've calculated is added to the basic allotment. So they're worth the 6160 plus the weight of whatever that program is calculated.
Certain programs are like 1.25.
That's right.
There are certain special education programs that are like 4.
That's correct.
The most severe students that require one-on-one aids and stuff like that.
It really just depends on what program they're in. So golden pennies. So there's 8 total available. There's 9 total available copper, and these are both copper and golden. You can only get through voter approval. So right now, see, you can see the little note at the bottom. Abilene has 5 golden pennies, so 5 of the 8. So I'm going to split these. See if I can split them. So we have 5. There's 3 left to get, and we have no copper pennies. Okay. So this will come in here in a second. We'll talk about what happens with the 5 we have. So this is total though, total what you can get, 8 golden, 9 copper. So again, voter approved, figured on WADA, weighted average daily attendance. And these are guaranteed amounts. So we talked about the guaranteed yield. So these amounts are guaranteed. The only other guarantee we have for tier 1 is the basic allotment. So the 6160, that's a guarantee.
That's tier 1.
That's tier 1. So other than that, this is the only guaranteed yield. So these amounts you can count on. The weights sometimes fluctuate, but guaranteed yield, it's really important to remember on these pennies. Because of the guarantee and because the gold is worth more than the copper, that's why they're considered enrichment. Also enrichment to our tier 1, so this is tier 2. This is, again, the only way we can increase our revenue. And you'll see that pretty clear here in just a second when we talk about how our entitlement's built. The only way we can really increase is right here in tier 2. Everything else is, we're in some really defined lanes. Okay, so next piece is state aid. Here's where we get to the fun stuff. So, tier 1 entitlement. So, our basic allotment, 6160 per ADA. Then you start adding in the weights. So, special populations, special education, ESL bilingual, career in tech, any kind of programs like that. That's added into the basic allotment, so a weight, and then also allotments for special programs. We'll talk about some of the allotments. All of those combined equal our revenue. So what's not on this, right? Taxes are nowhere on here, right? So we're going to talk about the role of tax in a second. Taxes have nothing to do with calculating how much revenue we get, okay? The only thing that has anything to do with how much revenue we get are these things right here. The basic allotment, so how many students are attending school, how many students are attending school in the special populations, and then any kind of allotments we're eligible for equals our tier 1 entitlement. All right, here's the calculation of the tier 1 entitlement. So here's just kind of a basic rundown. And I put this over here because you're going to hear a few different things. The Tier 1 cost, Tier 1 allotment, Tier 1 entitlement. They're all the same thing, okay? So this is what the state says based on how many students we have coming to school. This is what they say we're eligible to receive in revenue. So I've starred every little thing that is something that we receive. So there's a few that we don't, but all of these things combined make up our Tier 1 entitlement. So our regular program, compensatory ed, so students that are at risk, okay? Special education, you get into some allotments, small and mid-size allotment. Career technology is another weight. Go through all of these things, and when you combine all of them together, that equals our Tier 1 allotment or the revenue we should be receiving. So we're gonna work on that. So that's what I got first. So imagine this jar, I'm gonna slide it over, is our Tier 1 entitlement. So the first thing that's going in is our regular program, so $61.60 a student, okay? So we've got all kinds of students. Here's one, see they're a little different. We've even got a little bigger. So we'll say this one is just a general ed student, okay? It's gonna go in our allotment. This one may be like in career and tech or bilingual. This one may be a SPED student. So their weights are different, okay? Their weights on this scale are different depending on what program they're in. So we're gonna start adding these. And there's one. What about this one? A little baby. So these would be like our pre-K kiddos, right? So here's the thing with them. They're going into our allotment, but they only generate half. We serve them all day, so we have a cost for all day, but they're only getting half the allotment. Does that make sense?
Why is that?
That is one of the unfunded mandates that we're also going to talk about here in a second. So we're going to add them all to the bucket, okay? So here's all of our students, all right? But the problem is our Tier 1 entitlement, so this is if every student in our district that was enrolled was in our Tier 1 entitlement. But we're not funded on enrollment, right? So we're only funded when they come to school. So some of them don't come to school. They have vacation or, whatever. So we're going to take some out because we don't get funding for these kids. We're only funded for who's here. This is average daily attendance. That's exactly right. So these are the kiddos that came to school. This is what we're going to get funding on. All right, let's start moving through. What about this? Transportation. So transportation, right here, transportation is an allotment. We get about $1 a mile on our transportation report when we turn in our route services report. Is it enough to cover what they give us in our transportation allotment, our transportation program? No, not even close. But we get some transportation money. What about this? Safety and security, right? So, where are we? School safety. Okay, so we get school safety money. But also with that, what did they mandate we have at every campus? That's right. So what do we get for school safety? We get about $10 a student and $15,000 per campus. Can you get an SRO at a campus for $15,000? No way. Okay, so it's some, but again, not near enough. So what about this? Teacher incentive allotment, right? That's something we get. We get some funding for teacher incentive allotment. Most of it is paid out right back to the student, to the teachers that qualify, but that is an allotment. And then we've got a few other allotments. So some of them we get, some of them we don't. What about CCMR, so Career College Military Ready? Okay, this is one that's changing for us, okay? we're going after the CCMR. NEFA, so this is new instructional facility allotment. So the year we opened the lift, we got NEFA funds. You only get this if you're opening a new instructional facility, and this allotment is capped. So if there's a lot of instructional facilities opening in the state and you're in that bucket, it's a weighted allotment based on how many are going on in the state. So that's not something we get. The mentor allotment is not something we get. Residential placement, so we have some students in residential placement. We do get money for that. I'm gonna put that in our bucket. Fast growth, we are not considered a fast growth district, so that is not something we get. And then the small and mid-size allotment, that is also, we are not considered small or mid-size, so that's also not an allotment we get. So all of these things put together make up our Tier 1 entitlement. So when you combine everything that's in this jar, this is essentially what the state says we should get in revenue. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay, let's stair step it. So funding the Tier 1 entitlement. So I mentioned earlier, taxes weren't anywhere in that, okay? So we've built our Tier 1 allotment. We know exactly what we're supposed to get, what the state says we should get in revenue. So who's going to pay for it, right? Well, the first is the ASF. So we talked about this earlier, the available school funds. So this is, again, that $400. I'm going to put these in here. It's about $400 per student. It's based on your prior year average daily attendance. And for us, you can see it's about 7% of our Tier 1 entitlement. So it's not much. Okay, it's some, but it's not much.
400 times.
Our prior year average daily attendance. So about 7%. Let's give this a good, we'll give it a little more. All right, so that's about how much we get in available school funds. All right, so here's next step. So then, after you take that, the next step is your local fund assignment. So this, after your Tier 1 is figured, your Tier 1 entitlement, you take out what you get in your available school fund. The next is local fund assignment. So they want to know how much of our local fund assignment, our property taxes, can fund our Tier 1 entitlement. So for us, for Abilene, it's about 34% of our entitlement is funded locally. So here's where the property tax comes in. Okay, so 34% of our Tier 1 entitlement isn't a whole lot. Let's pour some in here. All right, let's see how we're looking. Okay, so we're starting to build our layers. All right, we'll stop there. So once we add in our available school fund and then how much our property tax, so our property tax rate and our value, how much it can fund of our Tier 1 entitlement, then essentially the state fills the rest. So state funds are paid through the Foundation School Program, and this is only given to you to complete the Tier 1 entitlement. So if your local fund does not complete the Tier 1 entitlement, then you get state funds. So how we talked about earlier, property wealthy districts, generally when that happens and they have to pay back to the state, this green goes all the way over. That doesn't happen for us. So we depend heavily on state funds. So that is essentially how we build our Tier 1 allotment and know what we're entitled to receive. And then this is, the layers are how it's funded. Okay, so available school fund, local fund assignment, our property taxes, and then state funds. Any questions on this?
the local property tax is pretty well set by the state then, as with the formulas as to what we can or can't charge.
That's right. It is, because this layer is really our MCR, our tier 1.
Is it okay if I'm
Yes.
gonna get, you're gonna get to what I'm not gonna ask you. 'Cause I'm gonna get to it.
Okay. All right, so this is tier 1. So, and imagine this is all the way full, right? This is tier 1. So what about tier 2? So we've talked about the gold and copper pennies. So tier 2 enrichment. I'm gonna go to this then. So again, 8 total golden pennies, 9 total copper. We have 5. So I'm gonna say that this is our tier 1, and our tier 2 are these 5 golden pennies. This is all we have right now in tier 2 funding. So this is our set revenue amount. This is how it's funded through the 3 available school, local, and state. This is the only enrichment we can get in our revenue, right there in tier 2. So again, guaranteed yields, and this part, the district's tax base, if a district's tax base cannot generate this guaranteed revenues based on the guaranteed yields, then that's when the state comes in and provides the rest. So I wanted to see, this next slide, it may seem a little overwhelming because there's lots of numbers, but I wanted you to see exactly how it works here in Abilene. Okay, so this is the tier 2 detail report from our summary of finance. So you can see right here, AISD golden pennies. So we're on level 1 of tier 2. So level 1 of tier 2 is the golden. We have 5 golden pennies, so our 5 in tier 2. So then here's our tier 2 level collection. And you can see it's based on an entitlement based on WADA, so weighted average daily attendance. So this is, again, what they say we should get. Just like we built with our students, all of that thing, building our tier 1 entitlement, this is what they say our tier 2 entitlement is. And then we go through the same process. How much can we fund locally based on our DVP or our district property value and tax rate? And you can see we can fund about $3 million of it locally. The rest comes from the state. So even though we have 5 golden pennies and it's additional tax pennies built into our tax rate, only $3 million of it is coming from our local share. The rest of it is coming from the state. Any questions on that?
We didn't use up all our local in the other tier 1.
No, because these are enrichment pennies. So the tier 1 is really calculated separate, and then you calculate your tier 2. Does that make sense? So level 2 of tier 2 is copper pennies. So ours are all 0 because we have no copper pennies. If we had copper pennies, then we would have the same calculation based on the guaranteed yield through the district property value, what the local share would be, and then again what the state share would be. And then the 2 together, level 1, level 2, gold and copper, would equal our tier 2 revenue. Any questions on that?
Where did the 129.52 come from? What
Oh, right here.
yeah.
That is the guaranteed yield for per, right, see right here, 129.52. So that's the guaranteed yield per penny. So they essentially are taking that times our weighted average daily attendance to get our entitlement in the calculation. Okay, so here's taking an actual look for our school year 24-25. This is actually how our tax rate stacks up. So if we were to stack all of the pennies, and let me flip this over because the red is INS. So INS, remember, is just set to cover our bonded debt payments. If we were to stack them all up, we would start with the black pennies, so our maximum compressed rate, which right now is 63.9 cents. We would add in any golden or copper pennies we have. We only have 5 golden, so we're adding them in. So there's tier 1, tier 2, and then you add in your INS rate, and that gives you your total tax rate that we're allowed to charge as a district. Does that make sense? So,
Determines INS though.
say that one more time, I'm sorry.
Do we know what determines INS? Do we know what determines INS?
What determines INS is what your bond payments are.
It's gonna be,
It's just simply math between what our bond payment is and what we need the rate to be based on our value.
Is there any wiggle room in setting the INS rate?
There is not. The INS rate is just simply, it can only be used for bonded debt payments. So it is just simply, what do you need to make the debt payment? That's what your tax rate is.
And those are bonds that are voter approved.
That's right.
And
That's
then
correct.
The rate is published both on the county appraisal district and through board documents in a thing called Truth in Taxation, where you can see what our bond payments are and how many pennies it takes to make just that payment, no more, no less.
Just to show that we don't go on and on and on charge.
That's right.
The only way that, it's important for you to know as board members that the only way the INS rate generates more than a bond payment is if the collections are over 100%. So, and we actually don't project the INS rate based on 100% collection because that's a myth. Although our own CAD has done well and gotten to 100%, sometimes because of property value growth and the cost, the actual the levy when it happens and is collected. But generally speaking, they should equal each other.
For sure. So here's a good look at our tax rate. So just putting in the build, this 68.9 includes our 5 golden pennies. So they live in the M&O. Okay, so this is really the MCR plus our golden pennies plus our INS rate to get to our total tax rate. You can see how it's kind of stair-stepped down over the years. Some of that is in the INS rate as we've paid down debt. We don't need as much. There's really 2 things. Our property value has increased. Okay, so we don't, because the value has increased, we don't have to tax quite as much. And then also we've paid down the debt, so our debt payment's not as big. And then the change in the M&O is really driven by compression. So again, as our property value rises, our tax rate is compressed by the state to what we can tax on.
Can you go back a slide?
Yeah, sure.
I think as, maybe you're gonna cover this, but as we talked about Vader, how we said if our tier 2 increased, we could keep the total tax rate the same by decreasing INS. But we don't have any control over that.
That's right.
Did I misunderstand that?
So there is a little wiggle room. The only way is if rates rise, okay, so property values rise, and your bond payment is going down. So naturally your INS rate will go down. You see what I'm saying? So as that rate starts to decline, then it is really a natural offset if you were to go get more golden or copper pennies. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
So we can't really control INS, we're just hoping that
That's right.
property values go up and our debt.
Yes. And you really, like earlier in the presentation, how we talked about a lot of things are based on estimates. Really, that's another one of the things, we have preliminary values and then we get our certified values. So we have a good idea of what our tax rate, our property value and what our tax rate can be, when we go to set things like that. There is some estimates that we can do ahead of time just based on trend, how much our property value has grown over the past. For us, with the Lansing project coming online and things like that, that will have huge implications for what our values will look like.
Thanks.
Yes, sir. Okay, and then finally, where does the money go, right? So this is based on last year's budget. So the majority, we all know this, is living in payroll. This percentage, the 82.8, it's generally about 80. Now remember, we've had much work to do during this fiscal year to align our staffing with our enrollment. So while our number will likely be in the 80% neighborhood when we go to start building next year's budget, it's not going to be 82.8. Okay, our payroll costs have come down significantly in the general fund. But you can see payroll's the majority, okay? So that answers when we have a large budget deficit and we need to make drastic changes to get our budget balanced, where do you go, right? When payroll is this large of your budget, if you need to make bold moves, this is really where it lives. That's why there has been great work done with the staffing matrix and with Dr. Kuhn really aligning our staff to our enrollment. This is why that piece was so important, because the other slices of the pie are so small. So utilities, contracted services is really our next big piece. Supplies, materials, insurance, debt service. This is not bonded debt, so think anything like our copier lease, things like we have to account for those in a debt service function. So that's what that debt service is, and then any kind of capital outlay. So kind of bigger ticket items, we don't really have any of those this year in the budget. So that's a pretty small, insignificant piece.
Jan?
Yes, ma'am.
I have a question back. So we only have golden pennies to look at in that chart of a.
Yes, ma'am.
Do copper pennies look different? Do they add up differently in the tax base?
So the only thing that's different about how, based on the calculation we looked at of the golden pennies that we do have, the only thing that's different about the copper is their weight. So they're not as valuable. So where a golden penny is worth $129, the copper is only worth $49, a little over $49. The calculation is exactly the same, just at a different value.
So a golden penny counted 5 cents.
Right.
5 of them counted 5 cents. So how many does 8 copper pennies count?
So that's a great question. It essentially comes in like when you're building your stair step, it would look very much the same. It's just it's not going to generate as much money. Does that make sense?
But for the taxpayers, it's the same as a penny.
Yes.
And is commercial value equal to residential value?
That is a really great question. And I don't know that. So I will find out.
Generally speaking, yes, I think so.
Their exemptions they're vastly different. The available exemptions to residential versus commercial property is vastly different, but I think Jen will find out.
Okay.
Yes.
So I have something to add,
Okay.
because it's a common theme. So last legislative session, the homestead exemption changed. So in that jar over there, where we added the sand, Jen, can you help us understand when the homestead exemption changes $40,000 to the taxpayer like Joe who lives in Abilene ISD and has a property, what happens to that jar of sand?
So when that happens, essentially what happens is this green section starts to shrink a little. So we don't have as much value to tax on. So our value declines. Our rate, we already know our rate's been compressed because our property value grew, but our taxable value, so what we are allowed to tax on, declines because of the increased exemption. So that means our local share, what we can fund locally, gets smaller, and the state adds more.
And the height of the sand,
Stays the same.
So does the homestead exemption just affect the M&O and not the IMS?
That's correct. That's correct.
so the reason I asked that question for your own perspective as governing board members, and you set the tax rate, and these things are a part of what you do every day, or what you do as a major responsibility of being a trustee, is the total tax rate doesn't, or the total amount of sand in there won't change. And Jen did such a great job at like visually explaining that. But when the blue part grows, it's more expensive for the state. How does the state pay for that?
Raise our taxes.
They pay for it somehow. But our local property owners and that are eligible for a homestead exemption aren't, their portion, their switches but the total revenue we get and need doesn't.
That's right. And here, we're going to quiz you. I'm going to give you an opportunity to have a few, if you have any more questions, I'm happy to answer those. But then I've got a few quiz questions that'll actually spark some more of those things, just to kind of solidify some of the things we've talked about. So any other questions before we get to those? No. Any other questions?
Because our tier one does not meet our needs.
Right.
So you've got us covered up in sand that everything is taken care of, but in reality, there should be some kids' legs sticking out.
Right. That's these. Yes. That's these. Yes. And that's exactly what question 1 is about. So how does the district earn more revenue? Well, we're pretty tied, right? So the district only earns more revenue if what? Students increase and they come to school, or the basic allotment increases. That's it. There is no other way for our tier 1 allotment or entitlement to grow unless one of those two things happens. That's it. So that's why it's so important when we say the basic allotment hasn't increased since 2019. Our costs have increased significantly, but the state is still saying, well, that's all you get. That's all the revenue you should need to do what you're doing. So unless we grow in students and they come to school, or the basic allotment is increased, this jar stays exactly the same. Doesn't matter what our costs are. Does that make sense?
But we can earn more revenue through tier 2.
That's right. That is the only way we can earn more revenue. So number 2, not including the current legislative session, okay? So not including what's going on right now. What year was the last increase in the basic allotment? Yeah, 2019. So it's been a while, right? We're due.
I think that was 100%.
Yes. So number 3, how many golden pennies do we currently have? 5. That's right, 5. How many golden pennies can districts get total? 8. Yes. How many copper pennies can districts get? 9. Yes. And then finally, here's the bonus question. How do we get the golden and copper pennies? Yes, a VADER, a voter approval tax rate election. And Dr. Kuhn's going to talk about that later, here in a little bit, later in the meeting. Any other questions for me? All right. Thank you.
That was amazing. One of the best things I've ever seen. That was fantastic.
Thank you. Okay, I think we're going to pause.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, we gotta call a little bit of a timeout to deal with some technology, so everybody give us like 5 minutes.